For centuries, England played a leading role worldwide. The new tendency towards self-isolation does not seem to fit in with this. But the intellectual history of the country explains a lot. In addition to humor, the British regard their common sense as a second national virtue. It may be thanks to that the country has historically the most impressive track record of the great European nations. Nevertheless, in the near future, it will seal its greatest political folly and say goodbye to the EU for good. At least that's how the continental Europeans see it. If rationality is the specific characteristic of human consciousness, one should assume that it is the same in all people. That may be the case for the basic logical structure of thought, but there's only a purely logical way of thinking in science. In the rest of life, thinking is so polluted by beliefs, feelings and interests that in the end every person has its own way of thinking. This also applies to whole peoples. Before the training of the European nation states, the professional thinkers were in close contact across national borders. They were philosophizing theologians who, according to the command of the Church, philosophy was the handmaid of theology. But when, after the Reformation, thinking broke away from the tutelage of church dogmas, and at the same time the nation states developed their own cultural self-image, different thinking preferences developed. The French René Descartes was one of the first to break away from the primacy of the belief in relation and to see reason as the decisive source of knowledge. He believed that the rational person has innate ideas that the thinking consciousness can deduce mathematically from within itself. The opposite position was taken a little later by the Englishman John Locke, who believed that the consciousness of every human being at birth is an empty tablet that can only be described through experience, through sensory perception. The philosophical finesse of these two positions does not need to be discussed here, and I won't go into that at all. The only question is why the Cartesian approach under the term rationalism was adopted on the continent by great philosophers such as Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and developed into the predominant epistemology, while in England Locke's approach radicalized under the name empiricism by David Hume and is still considered the specific way of thinking of English philosophers. Descartes' model of thought is strictly hierarchical. In reason, it sees a pyramid. At the top, which stands the first immediate evidence, the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes uses his evidence to measure all further logical deductions from reason and sorts them according to their clarity. Everything that the thinking reason, clare et distincte, clear and distinct, find in itself must be true as the very first evidence. The derivation pyramid goes from the top down into the cloudy and dark areas of the central perceptions, which depend on the changing states of an outside world, of which one does not even know with certainty whether it exists at all and is not just imagined. With Locke, on the other hand, consciousness is an empty tablet that is only described through sensory perception. The mind can only sort these perceptions. If you have these two images in front of your eyes, the Cartesian pyramid and Locke's tablet, then one can assume that they reflect the different political and social structures of the home countries of these philosophers. Descartes' France was strictly hierarchical organized and an absolutist monarchy. Locke's England had a year before the publication of his empiristic book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, through the glorious revolution and transformed into a constitutional monarchy, which meant a leveling of royal authority. Rationalism remained the dominant philosophy on the continent until the French Revolution, and in Germany it passed into an equally vertical reason-based idealism. On the other side of the canal, the English monarchy was ruled by a parliament in which two major parties, the liberal Whigs and the conservative Tories, were balanced. Both these two parties and Parliament itself, in its relationship with the Crown, represent a horizontal relationship in which both sides are interdependent. This corresponds to the relationship between sensory perception and reason in Locke's model. It certainly seems a bit premature to see a causal connection in the structural homology between the form of thought and the form of government, especially since the English would have have to have discovered their preference for empiricism within a single year. However, if you take a closer look at English cultural history, it becomes clear that political change had a long lead. As early as 1295, under Edward I, the Parliament had a composition in which all relevant groups, high aristocracy, church, lower aristocracy, and the representatives of the cities, were represented, which was to change little until the first major reform law of 1832. The Glorious Revolution thus had a prehistory of 4 centuries. But empirical thinking did not begin with Locke either. It was practiced a generation earlier by Thomas Hobbes, and the first sign of it can already be seen in Roger Bacon, a Franciscan monk who lived and worked in the very century in which the horizontalization of the English power structures began with the Magna Carta of 1215, and in 1295 with the so-called Model Parliament found a fixed form. From then on, there was an institution in England, Parliament, which more and more became the central axis in the interplay of forces between the people and the crown. While in the other European nations the great upheavals came either from above or from the rebellious people, in England Parliament was almost always the place for such impulses. It is the place where conflicting interests are balanced through a compromise. The entire English community has something compromising about. The Anglican State Church is a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism, the English form of government one between republic and monarchy, and society as a whole between the egalitarian bourgeoisie and the privileges of the aristocracy that still exists today. It is obvious that the way people think about their social reality is reflected. Would be strange if it weren't for that. Both spheres, hard word, have to do with the relationship between the individual and the whole. The social sphere is about the relationship between the citizens and the state, while the cognitive one is about the relationship between the individual thing and the generic term. The decisive factor is from which of the two sides the thinking starts. For continental rationalism and later German idealism, the primacy of the whole always applied. Totality is a central concept in German philosophy. It hardly plays a role in the thinking of the British, though. Their empiricism is fundamentally based on the individual case. This can be seen in all areas of social and private life. Most of British law, for example, consists of precedents that have the legal force of statutes. And even today, British law is case law that judges case by case in the light of previous decisions instead of being based on systematic legal norms. Even with something as mundane as securing electrical circuits in the home, the English prefer to secure each socket individually rather than all via a central fuse box. In the conflict between the part and the whole, British thinking always leaned on the side of the part. This is also expressed in their humor, which is fundamentally on the side of the disruptor of order. We Germans prefer to laugh with order against the disturber. Nowhere is that more evident than in Carnival, when the crowd sways leisurely and pours their mockery on the passing figures on the floats. You can see a lot of examples for this on my oldest German channel, which is a mixed channel, but recently I put some Carnival videos up there as well. For centuries, the English have done well with their anti-authoritarian individualism. Perhaps it contributed to their being the first by many of the great European nations. They were the first to have a parliament, the first an emancipating middle class, the first a constitutional monarchy, and the first an industrial revolution. If printing had existed 100 years earlier, the Reformation might also have been initiated 100 years before Luther by Wycliffe from England. But at the moment it looks more as if the former vanguard of European history, stubbornly leaving the EU, will become the rear guard, which has missed the train of time. Liberal individualism no longer seems to fit into the global political landscape. In the competition with great powers such as China and the USA, the United Kingdom is only a lightweight and also sees itself under the sword of Damocles of the threatened separation from Scotland, which would make the decline for good. Anyone who envied the English for their pragmatic, sometimes downright cynical common sense before Brexit now sees its downside. After all, it makes a difference whether a nation in Europe skillfully plays the role of tip the scales, or whether the tip of the scales breaks and believes that it can deal with the heavy weights of the global economy on an equal footing. Even if the EU will for a long time paralyze itself with national jealousies, the British, as the second largest economic power, would certainly have had better cards within the association than in the role of David against the rest of the world. The decision in favor of Brexit made the majority of continental Europeans doubt the common sense of the British. Apart from the deep-sea fishermen, hardly any industry is likely to benefit from it. As an industrialized nation, the United Kingdom would only be competitive on low wages. As Singapore on the Thames, it will continue to split into rich and poor. Failure to foresee all of this shows a political immaturity that one would least have expected of the British. Perhaps they should have remembered that the Normans' conquest, later stigmatized as the Norman yoke, was the greatest stroke of luck in their history. Had William I not conquered the island and brutally forced a unitary state on it, the Anglo-Saxons might have developed the same particularism as the German tribes. After all, prior to the conquest, Britain temporarily had 7 kingdoms. The whole thing has something of its own, especially when it's big. And if you now want to know more about Brexit, YouTube has chosen another of my videos right here for you on the end screen, next to the subscribe button. And if you got to this point of the video, I'm really happy about this. It was something different, I know. Then you really have to subscribe. I'll see you in my next video. Click and enjoy. Viel Spaß.